Hello everyone and welcome to Extreme Graphics Tech. My name is Angelo and I want to start the year by showing you the performance of the RTX 20 Super in 2024. And why do I want to do that? Well, there is two reasons. When I bought the RTX 2060 6GB, the RTX 20 Super was already in the market. However, the reason I decided to go for the 2060 and not the Super version was because I wanted to have the lower end RTX GPU at the time to show that it was capable of ray tracing gaming, even if it was just slightly, and that it was a capable GPU, which I think still is, considering it's more than 4 years old in the market by now. So I think it's still a very capable graphic card. Of course, I wouldn't recommend anyone to buy it new, but just because we left December behind, I'm sure many people upgraded. Okay, so many people are now going to be throwing their old GPUs onto eBay or Facebook Marketplace and so on, just to recoup some of the money that they spend on their upgrades. And so I think it's time for me to test the RTX 20 Super, which I just got on the used market, because probably now many of these cards, the RTX 20 Super, are going to be placed on to be sold. I think many people are going to want to understand if it's worth it to upgrade or to pay a little bit extra money for the Super instead of the RTX 2066 gigabytes. So, of course, I wouldn't recommend anyone to upgrade from a 2060 normal to a Super, but depending on what you have on the past and you want to understand if it's worth, then that's what I want to discuss today. So let's see the benchmark and then get our conclusions. And as usual, I'm starting with Dying Light 2. In this case, I'm using the exact same preset that I used with the RTX 2060 in the test, which is what I find is the optimal. I tried other settings, but none of them really made any difference or kept the game over 60 FPS. However, here, even though it's the same setting, we are having much better frame rate and stable frames, which means that we start good. It's not a huge difference in this one. We're talking like 10 frames of difference maybe, just more, lower or higher lows and lows, but nothing huge. However, this I find this to be a good start for the RTX 2060 Super. Now on Hogwarts Legacy, once again, I went for a different preset that I normally try to test the 2060, and that's because I don't think ray tracing in this game is something much people are going to play with these sort of cards, and I try to push it just when I want to show that it's possible, but because we are trying to prioritize frame rate here, then as you can see, using 1440p DLSS balance and the high preset without ray tracing, we can get over 60 FPS easily and keep a game that is very fluid, even at 80 FPS. So I will say this is a very good result for a game like this that we know is not the best optimized game, but it's still running very, very good on this GPU. Now, The Last of Us Part 1 we know is a problematic game. However, normally when using the RTX 2060, we have to limit the game to the medium preset because the 6GB of VRAM don't allow for the game to run very well when you use the high preset. With the 2060 Super, however, we can use the high preset. And I know it's not running at a perfect 60 and it has dips here and there, but this is kind of the same performance you get with the RTX 2060 when playing at medium. So I will say we are gaining here the capacity to play at high, keeping the same frame rate. Of course, you can change some values and maybe keep the texture higher just to get a more stable frame rate, but I will say that in those 2GB of VRAM are making us have a better gaming experience. On Spider-Man Miles Morales is a little bit more of the same in this case because we are having ray tracing, however, in this game on with the 1440p DLSS balance and the high preset, and we are having a very good experience. On the RTX 2060, because of the 6GB of VRAM, sometimes you're going to see the game dipping a lot when it comes to traversal movement. So in this case, we are not having that issue. In the cinematic, yes, you can get up around 45 frames depending on the situation. However, because they are cinematics and they don't affect the gameplay that much, so I will say that this is a very good result in general for the 2060 Super in 2024. Now with Cyberpunk, this is quite interesting. Normally with a 2060 non-super, if you the only options you can activate when it comes to ray tracing is shadows to have like a 30 FPS experience at this resolution. However, with the 2060 Super, we're able to also activate ray trace reflections on the Ultra preset and both shadow options on the and still have an experience above 30 FPS. Actually, I will say that the average is around 40 FPS, which means that if you have a good monitor or VRR monitor, you can have a very good experience having all three ray trace effects on this game, which is quite something, I have to say. If you want to play at 60, my recommendations is to just remove all ray tracing and go to 1440p, and you will be able to go to 60 FPS, no problems. However, I want to remind people that I am pushing these cars a lot, so I'm using mostly 1440p, yes, with DLSS, but you can also play at 1080p with DLSS quality and have a much better experience in terms of performance. So you may activate some other ray tracing options in there or have a different performance altogether. However, the reason I push them is to try to compare with what I have done before. And from my point of view, the fact that you can push it this much right now means that in the future you can still have a 1080p experience, which is what this car is actually made for, if you ask me. On Resident Evil 4 remake, for example, I'm using the exact same preset I used before with the RTX 2060 normal because I couldn't get any other, option to actually make the game better. However, we're having a much better experience once again because the frame rate is much more stable, the frame time is much more consistent, so that's a good option when it comes for the whole ray tracing option for these cards, because that you have more gigabytes of VRAM, which lends you, even on situation with explosion and transparencies, a much better and stable frame rate, which is quite good. So those 2 gigabytes and obviously extra speed are doing wonders to stabilize. In the case of the Starfield, this is a game that also I couldn't get it to a higher preset or less DLSS or anything like that compared to the 2060. All we get here is like a more stable frame rate and higher frame rate, but not by much. I will say around 10 FPS maybe, which doesn't make a whole difference when you're going just from maybe 60 to 70. So in this game in particular, there is not a huge difference, but of course, always 10 FPS more is better than not having them. But I'm just saying this is not one game that benefit a lot from having those that 2060 or those 2 extra gigabytes of VRAM. Alan Wake 2, we know, is a very heavy game that is barely playable of these cars, but in the RTX 2060 Super, we can play this at 1440p DLSS balance with the low preset, no RT effects. However, on the RTX 2060, we have to play the same configuration but with DLSS performance. So at least we are able to have a higher level of DLSS, which means a higher image quality, but also you can see that you still have better frame rate we had in the video with the RTX 2060 when we analyzed Alan Wake. So that's a win-win here, because even though we are not having a lot of difference, there is some to be had. Now on Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is another game where I could not really gain much difference. Of course, if you tweak manually instead of using the presets like I do, you're probably going to get better experience. It's just that I have to use preset for comparisons and easiness of doing the videos. However, here I'm using the same preset I use for the RTX 2060 when analyzing the game, just for comparison, and what we get is a more stable frame rate and a higher frame rate too. It's not that much higher, but it's much more stable than it was on the RTX 2066 gigabytes. So I will say all in all that the 8 gigabyte version, the 2060 Super, even though it's not hugely different, does benefit most games. Well, as you have seen, I think the 2060 Super is still a very capable card, and it's probably the card that should have launched initially. So the biggest difference between the 2060 6GB and 2060 Super, evidently, and the first thing you will think is the extra 2GB of VRAM. And I think that's a very important difference here, because that will allow you to play games at a higher quality that we could not do with the normal 2060, like The Last of Us Part 1, which we had to play at medium with the 2060 on previous benchmark. We can now play at high because using higher texture. So now we can play that with a high quality using the 2060 Super. But that's not the only difference, because there is more CUDA core, more RT cores, more Tensor core, and the GPU is clocked higher. So this also gives a boost which is around 20%, which doesn't sound too much depending on the situation, because for example, if you're playing already at 60-65 FPS, that is going to take you to 70-75, which is probably not going to make a big difference depending on the monitor you have, but at least it's going to stabilize those frames, and is going to be more you're going to be sure that it's going to be over 60 FPS all times, instead of maybe dipping. Some people don't care, some people will. But also we have noticed that we can, have more RT effects in some games, or have a more stable frame rate when it comes to RT. But that's not just because there is more RT cores, more Tensor cores to help with DLS, but probably because of the 2 extra gigabytes of VRAM. Because with those, then the VVA structure can stay in the memory of the card. In this case, I'm talking about games like Cyberpunk that we saw we could activate an extra RT feature without losing too much performance, and that is a thing we cannot do on the 2060 6GB. We cannot activate reflections essentially because it uses so much memory that the games start to go much slower no matter how much DLSS we use. But also on games like Spider-Man with ray trace reflections active, the game is much more stable than on the 2060 6GB. So from my point of view, to begin with, I have to say I'm very glad to have this GPU, because I always wanted to have it on my collection to test game and to see the difference those 2 gigabytes of VRAM can make on some of game. We saw that in games like Starfield, it didn't make like a big difference. We got maybe better stable frame rate. We saw on Alan Wake 2 that we can go to balanced DLSS instead of performance, keeping even a better performance, but we could not go like to a medium preset or use a DLSS any RT features or anything like that. So all we got was a little bit better image quality. So on some games it's going to make a big difference, on some games it's not. But even so, I think if you can find this used GPU on the market for 20% more, 30% maximum more than the normal price that you can get a 2060 on your country, then I think it's worth it. So for example, if the price in your country, used or new, whatever it is that you find it, is $100, so I wouldn't pay more than $125, $130 for the car. But I can't put a price because every country evidently is different for many reasons. But I will say that the 20%, 30% extra for the 2060 Super is worth it. But I wouldn't pay more than that, okay? I don't think the difference justifies just those extra 2 gigabytes, because if it's more than that, I will prefer to just adjust my graphics a little bit more and have it basically on the same performance on the 2060. However, I do think that the 2060 Super is the way the 2060 should have launched. But well, we know the story. We know that was a very bad generation of GPUs in terms of price performance and all of that. But is what we got at the time. So now that the market is probably going to be flooded by these cards, I would recommend you to look at the normal price of the 2060 and see if you can find a 2060 Super for either the same price or just a little bit more. But don't pay like 40%, 50% more than the 2060, because you are not going to get that performance back in terms of money ratio performance. Okay, so I will say that yeah, I'm quite happy to have the 2060 Super now in my collection as part of the benchmark and test that we can do in the future. I think being an 8 gigabyte card is going to be a much better proposition. It's sort of the same with the 5700 from AMD that we've been testing. I think they are very capable cards, both of them, and that they should still last quite a while. We saw how I can play most of the game at 1440p using the DLSS, but that means that if games start getting more and more demanding, we can lower the resolution to 1080p and maybe also use the DLSS. But as we saw, we can still use some RT effects. We can disable them if we don't want to, and so on. So I think it's a card that if you buy it now, is going to last you for a while. And in terms of emulation, which I didn't test here, but by my experience with the 2060, you should have no problems running even to PlayStation 3 and everything. It should run fantastic with this GPU, especially with the 2060 Super. So I hope this video, guys, help you if you are deciding or looking for a bargain now that many people are probably going to dump this on eBay or used market. So keep an eye on, because if you're looking to upgrade your computer for something quite old, then a 2060 Super is quite a good option. Thank you very much, and see you on the next video.